So let's talk D&D 3.5 versus 5e one final time. Sean and I have done 2 videos here on the channel discussing the differences between 5e and 3.5, and those have been some pretty polarizing videos, and I realized that in doing so we talked a lot about differences that we perceived in the game, and I recognize too, and this is kind of my fault for not quashing it early enough on, some of the rules that we cited in 3.5 that were different were not the case. The actual rules. Those are the rules we played with at the tables we were at, not the official rules contained in, the actual source material. So this is a final discussion of D&D 3.5 versus 5e, and I'm not going to be going into it from a what rules are different. I'm going to be going into it what I think one does the best and one I think the other does the best, and how you could possibly achieve a happy medium between the two. And if that sounds interesting to you, stay tuned. So I was thinking about this while I was at Gen Con this year, and I said to myself, why do I have such fond nostalgic memories of 3.5? And part of it is because it was my first experience with Dungeons & Dragons at all. So there's that nostalgia piece, which is why I'm sure a lot of people are nostalgic for, AD&D or any other edition that they've played in the past. Possibly why people are nostalgic for Pathfinder if they switched over to 5e or something like that, or went to 3.5 from Pathfinder, whatever the case is. That's where they started, so that's why they're nostalgic. So there's definitely that. That's part of the reason why I love it so much. I think I cited in one of our other review videos that I really liked it because it had a lot of options, and that is definitely true. I mean, I used to love sitting down with a stack. I mean, there's a whole shelf just basically here, kind of right off screen, that's just all my 3.5 books. There's probably 50 plus books there. And I used to love to sit there for hours and flip through every book to find that obscure feat or race or alternative class feature to allow me to make a really interesting and unique build. And sometimes it wasn't even the idea of making a super overpowered build. It was taking a weird combination of things to make what would previously be considered an underpowered or pointless build in 3.5 to make it somewhat viable. And that is true. I did definitely enjoy that. Now we are 5 years into 5e at this point, so we do have significantly more options than when Sean and I did that first video. I think the only books that were out were the DM's Guide, the Monster Manual, and the Player's Handbook for the original one. So we didn't have a Xanathars, we didn't have any extra races in Volos or Mordenkainens or anything like that. So we were pretty limited in our options. So one of the things that was different was 3.5 had more options. Now 5e does have more options. It doesn't have anywhere near what 3.5 had 5 years in. And that's a good thing and maybe also a bad thing. So I don't want to belabor that discussion too much though. It had more options. It had options like things like prestige classes, and I think multi-classing was more prevalent in 3.5, and it also made sense though because you had so many different options for base classes and prestige classes that you could multi-class and it worked. So aside from options, which again I think I've addressed enough at this point, what do I like so much about 5e and what do I like so much about 3.5? So I think it actually comes down to a few key points. I think I personally enjoy the background mechanics and the way those things work more in 5e, and I enjoy the combat more in 3.5. And I'll go into that a little bit. So I like the way skills work in 5e in that there's a reduced amount of skills overall. Like you don't need to have a listen, search, and spot separate skill. It is something as simple as a perception check. Although you could argue that the difference between perception and investigation kind of toes that line. I do miss some of the skills from 3.5, like appraise, for example. There's no good way to accurately tell as a player in 5e without I mean, it's all on the DM at this point, but there's no way for you to be able to tell how much something is worth very easily. That's a very, very minor nitpick. But one of the things I do like about the 3.5 skill system was the ability to put skill points in a given skill. So even if you were not proficient with it, you could still have some modicum of a positive bonus in it. For example, in 5e, if you have a 0 intelligence modifier, there is no way for you to get any bonus to, say, a nature check unless you took proficiency in it, or you take a feat-like skill down the road and then choose to get the proficiency then. Or if you're something like a bard, where you have jack of all trades and you get a bonus to skills you're not proficient in. There's no way to kind of grant, other than, through homebrew mechanics or whatever else, giving people extra skill proficiencies, which is something you obviously can do, but that was a way you would never be as good if, nature wasn't your class skill in 3.5. So that's kind of how that breaks down. I enjoy the saving throw mechanic for 5e. I like that it doesn't make certain skills that much more of a power stat, right? Dex, Constitution, and Wisdom are not super power stats, though those are the 3 most common saving throws you'll have to make when it comes to spells. But there are still things like strength saving throws. There are intelligence and charisma saving throws, albeit they're not that common. But when they do come out, they are pretty dangerous things overall. So I enjoy that about 5e. I enjoy the proficiency bonus mechanic, rather than having to keep track of something like a save bonus, a base attack bonus. It's relatively simple in that respect. You have a proficiency bonus. If you're proficient with it, you add the proficiency bonus. If you're not, you don't. That's pretty simplistic. I love the advantage-disadvantage mechanic. I think it works relatively well than having to try to keep track of a million different minus, I have a plus bonus to this, +2 from this thing, +3 from this thing, -2 for this situation, and just saying you have advantage or disadvantage on the roll negates a lot of that, and it helps keep the play cleaner and helps keep things, moving a little bit further along. So I enjoy those, just a little mechanical things. But back to my point that I kind of deviated from before is the background and roleplay mechanics of 5e and why I like those. So having a background in 3.5 was largely just a character-based decision, and you either had it or you didn't, and it wasn't necessarily a huge thing. Having a quote background mechanic, as we do in 5e, where you do get some skill proficiencies or tool proficiencies or languages or some combination of all 3, as well as a cool background sort of feature that you can sometimes use, like, I don't know, for example, a sailor can gain passage on a ship, right? That's something that you can use, but it is largely a role-play mechanic. You also get some gear and things that also tie to your background. And I like that. I mean, there's also the ability to customize them and make your own, which is great. But it's actually forcing you to have that decision of what did your character do before they started adventuring, and it gives you skills associated with it, a interesting background feature. It gives you the idea. You don't have to necessarily use them, but the ideals, traits, bonds, flaws, that kind of a thing. It gives you ideas and ways to further build and bolster your character's roleplay. And one of the things that I do really enjoy about that mechanic as well is it is not tied to an ability score in any way. So if you want to be a hyper-intelligent barkeep, right? Say you're a bartender, that is your background, right? And you can be super smart. You don't have to be the strong, burly bartender as if it's giving you a bonus to strength or constitution. You could be the scholarly student and you could have a horrible intelligence score, and maybe that's why you stopped being a scholar and became, an adventurer, because you were bad at it. But the fact that the background features are not tied to a hard, crunchy number, and that they're not giving you a bonus to proficiency in something, other than the skill proficiencies, but they're not giving you a bonus to an ability score or something like that. I really enjoy that aspect of it. I also enjoy that the whole purpose, really, of the background mechanic, other than to get you think about making your character more well-rounded, is that it's used for the inspiration mechanic that further invests you in wanting to role-play your character. The whole thought of inspiration is you're supposed to give it to a player as a dungeon master when they do something that exemplifies one of their background abilities, whether they're personifying their ideal or, playing up their flaw or whatever the case may be. You are giving them a tangible re-roll of something that they can use whenever they want because they went above and beyond and role-played their character in this background that they built for them as part of this mechanic. So I really enjoy that aspect of it, and I think that, and I remember back when I played 3.5, my character had like a very loose background, if at all, and I'd say no character, I don't think anybody I played with in any campaign that I ran or played with like wrote up a backstory that they then like sent to the DM, here's my backstory for you to look at if you want to use anything. And every time I've played in 5e, someone has sent me at least 3 paragraphs on their character's background to help me get an understanding of their character. And I think that's largely because of the background mechanic kind of makes you think in that mindset. So what I like about 3.5 better, and this may be going back to our options scenario, but I think combat was more interesting in 3.5. 5e combat is interesting, don't get me wrong, but you could do a lot more cool and unique things in 3.5 in combat. Everybody could do them, and that's not really a thing in 5e. Some of the reasons why is, again, one, as we talked about, there are a ton more options for brand new spells. Almost every book came out with a new spell, a new feat, or new magic items, or all 3 in 3.5. So there was a ton of other options for things you could do for counterplay and different things for different classes. So that was a large benefit and a bonus to 3.5 in that respect. So I think we're going to have to just cut options out of this as a reason why the combat was more interesting. Because again, as I talked about, you can't really compare them because they're 2 different animals in that respect. But there was just more overall mechanics and things you could do in 3.5 in combat that you just can't do in 5e, or it's replicated in some aspects, but it's only like a certain subclass can do it, whereas this was a thing that anyone could have done in the past. So to further discuss that, I've busted out my 3.5e Player's Handbook to just look through some options under the combat section to just, make sure that I'm not misremembering. So I see as I'm looking through this a lot of things that are replicated relatively accurately here in 5e, right? Like, so I'm looking at different options, right? So combat was a little more interesting. Spellcasters had to be more careful when they cast spells because casting a spell in melee could provoke an attack of opportunity, for example. So it made casters have to think more mechanically about how they were going to maneuver around the battlefield. Flanking was an always-on thing, not an optional rule. I know a lot of people play with it, but it's an optional rule in 5e. That was a very real mechanic in 3.5. There were a lot of different abilities you could do. You could go total defense, which could boost your attack, which is similar, I guess the reference would be to a dodge action. You have the withdrawal ability or maneuver, which was basically your disengage. You had run, which was your dodge. And then I'm looking through to see what some of the special abilities are. We had the very real non-lethal damage, the ability to purposefully knock people out dealing non-lethal damage, which isn't really a thing in 5e. We have difficult terrain and different sized creatures. So let's get into the special kind of actions here. Oh, you did have the Coup de Gras maneuver, which was essentially if a player or a character or an enemy was completely helpless, you could essentially just finish them off as your action for whereas now that would be like, it's a roll with advantage in 5e and it would be an automatic critical hit, but there are situations where, and I still have issues with this in 5e, where you could have a completely unconscious character on the ground, and if you play by rules as written, you walk up to them and you stab them right in the throat, they're unconscious, asleep, whatever, you're not seen, and you go and do this. they can still survive mechanically. Obviously, the DM could choose to say that they don't and they just die. But if you play by rules as written, it's an attack with advantage, which one, you could miss on this helpless character, and two, it's only an automatic critical hit, it's not an automatic kill. And that's the difference there. So again, a little bit more tactical interest there. So let's talk about special attacks. You have the Aid Another ability, which is basically like the help action. You had the Bull Rush action, which could be taken as part of a charge, but basically you're attempting to push or shove an opponent backwards, which is similar to the shove action we do have in 5e. You had the charge mechanic, which was basically move up to twice your speed and attack. That's replicated in the charger feat, but this was something that anyone could do. You have the, and then there was things you could do to attack on a charge. You could ready against the charge, you could charge and then bull rush, try to knock people back. Certain weapons did different things with charging. You had the ability to attempt to disarm an opponent, to knock their weapon out of their hand. The only way you can currently do that now is if you're a Battle Master fighter and you have the disarming attack maneuver. There was the ability to grapple people's weapons and wrench them away from them. There was a feinting attack, so basically they can't dodge your next attack. Again, there's a feinting attack maneuver in the Battle Master. There is no real grapple-based builds in 5e because it doesn't do a lot of tangible things. You could really stack yourself in 3.5 to be a grappler, and that was a whole mechanic that you could really build a character around, and there's really not a good way to do that in 5e. A lot of the things like the grappler and the tavern brawler feat, like, they sort of contradict each other in some ways, and one lets you do something that feel like the other one should do. But there was all these different things you could do if you're grappling, and what you could stop people from doing. You could pin someone, you could have multiple people grappling. We have, mounted combat. We still have that in 5e. There was the overrun mechanic. You attempt to overrun somebody. You basically attempt to plow past them as you move. And you have to be, you can only overrun an opponent who's one size category larger than you, the same size or smaller. But again, this was like a running through someone to kind of try to knock them over, see if they avoid it. They might try to jump out of the way. Again, all things anyone could do. These are all just blanket mechanics anyone could attempt. Sundering, which is a thing that doesn't exist at all in 5e, was the ability to try to attack and break someone's weapon. Right? It's got Sundering, a short sword. It has hardness and HP for all items. So you could try to sunder a projectile weapon, sunder a shield, and basically break the shield so it's gone forever if you did enough damage to it. And you could build a character around sundering other people's weapons and other people's armaments and things like that to knock it down to reduce their viability in combat. Again, not a thing you can really do in 5e. Tripping attack. Anybody could trip someone to try to knock them prone. Now the only thing we can try to do is try to shove them prone, but you could try to trip an opponent as an unarmed melee attack, so it was still an attack. The only way to really trip anybody now is as a Battle Master fighter. Turn or rebuke undead, that's it's a cleric-specific thing. There was obviously rules for two-weapon fighting, there still is now. And then we have the ready action, which we still have, but there was also the delay action where you could try to delay to have your action happen later in the combat. So you still have your full, basically, action, but you would wait to have it happen later. That's kind of like the ready action in that respect. There's also a lot more crunchy rules on things like how certain spells interact with one another. Like counterspell, I think I would just flip to that page, right? Very specific about how counterspell works with things like meta magic and dispel magic as a counterspell. You can use dispel magic to counterspell another caster, and you don't need to identify the spell they're casting. However, dispel magic doesn't always work as counterspell. Like, they went through and picked a lot of these kind of questions that we had. There was the idea of arcane and spell failure. You can't cast in armor, or you might fail the spell. You got bonus spells for having a high ability score in a given stat, which also could help change the way you deal with combat. You had concentration, but you didn't have a limitation on the number of concentration spells you had. And I see that was sort of an issue, because like you'd start every day as a caster and you'd cast like 6 or 7 buff spells on yourself extended for long duration, and that would just be sort of a mechanic that you did to make your character better overall, and I get that, but there was no concentration mechanic in that you couldn't cast multiple spells that required an uptick duration. So you could do things like, say, cast your Spirit Guardians and your Shield of Faith and also your Flaming Sphere. And that was just a lot more for you to keep track of and the DM to keep track of as well. But that's a way to really... I mean, it also could make combat take a lot longer because you're going to have to deal with all of that. But it was things you could do. I'm just trying to see if there's anything else that really jumps out at me. No, I don't think so. Not particularly. But yeah, that, they actually have, let's see. Okay, yeah. So that is basically all I wanted to say about that. You know, I think that there was more options for summoning spells. A lot of different races, or a lot of different classes had access to higher level, like summon monster, summon nature's ally. There was a lot more minion-based things you could do. So it just added a lot of different layers to combat. You know, different weapons had different critical hit multipliers right out the base, right? You know, that was a thing you could do. Some of them would do triple or sometimes even 4 times damage on a critical hit. The fact that there were so many different enchantments you could get on magic items could make you alter the way you play to combat. 3 people, all the same class, all the same race, but with different chosen enchantments on their items, play combat entirely different. And again, there was a lot more feats that let you do a lot more unique and interesting things in a combat-specific scenario. I think about things just like far shot and point blank shot and multi-shot, all these different things for arrows, right? Things about deflecting spells and combat reflexes for multiple opportunity attacks. A lot of just things that could really make combat, give you a lot more options, I guess, in combat and what you could do. So I think that that's more or less where I stand as my final thoughts on the differences between 3.5 and 5e and why I play one versus the other and what other things I would change. So again, in summary, I like the proficiency mechanic and the advantage mechanic of 5e. I like the way backstories and backgrounds are handled, as they are, the one, to make you think about it, and 2, they don't give you anything really true mechanical benefits. Like every character gets 2 skills from a background, so it's not something that like you're going to get specifically from this one but not from this one. But it doesn't give you any ability scores, and it's not like part of a min-maxing scenario. And in 3.5 I like the combat better, because I think it really helps to make things more dynamic. And even, like I said, if you disregard options, the amount of things you, like, as when I say options, again, options for, there's just been so much different spell options and different armors and different weapons out there. Just the amount of things that any character could do, that list of combat actions I went through that are available to every character. Granted, some are going to be better at it than others, but that's, you know, but you still have the option to attempt to do that. There's also, I just thought about it now, there's ways to build up an unarmed strike based character that was not a monk. You had options and ways to do that in 3.5 that you don't really have ways to do that in 5e. You have to, if you want to be focused on being good at punching, you're not going to be a really great unarmed fighter, you know, unarmed strike fighter in 5e. The best way to do it is to be a monk. So little things like that. And again, I do like the ability that 3.5 had a way to boost up a skill that you wanted to be good at without having to just grant you like flat out proficiency like you would have in 5e. You could be not as good as other people who have it as a class skill, or in 5e's case, proficiency, but you could add a resource that you chose to add to that. It also, again, skill points were based off of intelligence, so it made intelligence a more useful, viable stat, which is not really a thing in 5e. If you're not a class that's focused on spellcasting that uses intelligence, intelligence could be a dump stat for most classes in 5e, and it's not going to be a big deal. I've played, I don't know how many characters with like an 8 or 9 intelligence, and it's never come back to bite me at all. because all of my other abilities were based on something like wisdom or dexterity, and I never had to look back. So that was just another thing. It made intelligence a more valued stat overall. It also gave you bonus languages, which is something I add as a homebrew in my own games to try to help make intelligence a little bit better. Anyway, I'm very curious what you guys think. I know these videos kind of get very heated responses, but I think since I approached it less from like, this is great and this is bad, it's what I really like about one and what I really like about another. And, you know, I said it at the beginning and now I'm remembering, I'm not really sure how you could combine the two. So obviously if you're playing 5e, you can keep the mechanics that you have, or if you're playing 3.5, you could bring in the idea of these background mechanics into your 3.5 game to help have the players focus more on like a roleplay and a backstory, and you could bring in the inspiration mechanic, right? The reroll of a d20 if someone really plays up the aspects of their character that they've designed. And as far as making combat more interesting in 5e, I don't really know. Like, part of me is just saying remove concentration as a mechanic, like let players calculate, or like have players cast multiple concentration spells at a time, but 5e isn't really balanced around the ability to do that, so that would be a problem. So I guess potentially you could incorporate all of those abilities that I talked about, the sundering, the tripping, fainting. Take a look at the Battlemaster Fighter abilities, and theoretically you could allow anyone to do that, but then that makes the Battlemaster Fighter not special at all. So I'm not really sure what you can do to make 5e's combat more interesting and dynamic like it was back in the day. But I'd love to hear your feedback. And I know obviously people are going to tell me 5e's combat is plenty fine, and it is. And I've been playing it for 5 years, and I haven't gone back to 3.5 for a reason. I do like 5e quite a bit. But I'm just saying I think that that's kind of where my differences are. And the fact that I think the culture for Dungeons & Dragons in general, at least in my personal experience, has shifted to be more of a story and roleplay focused game. Combat is still important, and people still do really enjoy that, but there's a larger focus on the roleplay aspect and the character building aspect. And I think that, again, because 5e lends itself so well to that, that's why a lot of people really enjoy 5e, because it's more simplified, allows things to move a little bit quicker, and there's a larger focus on storytelling and building a story together, rather than the crunchy hard numbers of how am I going to do the most damage possible in this round in combat so that I can defeat whatever the enemy of the week is. So let me know what you guys think in the comments below, whether you're a 3.5 or 5e player, or both, playing both simultaneously, or have played one or the other, or even those of you who've gone and played 4e I have no experience with, or anything prior to 3.5. Let me know what you think about this video. I'm curious. Do you feel the same way? Do you enjoy the roleplay and background mechanics that are developed for 5e? Do you feel like combat in 5e could be a little bit better, or more dynamic, or it was handled better in a different game or a different edition? I'm very curious. So let me know what you think in the comments below. If you're new to the channel and you like what I'm doing, I would love you to please click the subscribe button down below and throw this video a thumbs up if you've enjoyed it. And as a reminder, I stream every Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday evening Eastern Time on Twitch, where I do different gameplay things as well as character building. And then every other Sunday, my good friend Celeste from the Venture Maidens runs a one-shot kind of rotating cast, rotating one-shot schedule, so called Mistress of Modules. So if any of that sounds interesting, jump on over to our Twitch channel. There's a link in the description where you can follow us there. And if we hit 3,000, we're going to do a cool game where one of our players who doesn't really run games at all is going to try her hand at DMing pretty much for the first time, and also for the first time on stream. So anyway, hope you enjoyed it. I'll see you next time.